Good morning. Welcome to episode 89 of Duval Rundown. My name is Gus Logue. Today I'm joined by a very, very special guest. His name is Dan Pizzuta. He currently writes for the 33rd team, doing a lot of free agency and draft and general NFL content for them. I've been following Dan's work for a long time, definitely at least going back to when he was a contributor on Football Outsiders Almanacs with DVOA with Aaron Schatz, who actually, Aaron Schatz was our guest last week, so this is kind of like a perfect kind of segue into another fellow DVOA lover. And so Dan and I are just going to go over the Jaguars draft class, what they might do, or the free agency class, what they might do in the draft. Just kind of get like a general temperature check on what Dan, as more of a national insider or national analyst, thinks about the Jaguars. And so, Dan, really excited to have your expertise on the show. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Excited to talk about a team that is always interesting, at least. At least at this time of year, it's a team we can kind of get excited talking about and then see how it plays out, which it seems to be the path of Jaguars football over the past couple of years.
I know a lot of people are still recovering from like the whole Liam Coen leaving the Buccaneers kind of not in the middle of the night, but it was a whole situation and him becoming the head coach of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So I do have some questions about Liam and like what the offense might look like in the post Doug Peterson era. But I figure we start out with free agency since that's kind of what's on hand right now. There has not been a lot of recent activity, whether in Jacksonville or elsewhere. But the Jaguars were very active in the very first day of the negotiation period. They signed 9 new free agents. And so just as like, what's your like general vibe on the class, Dan? Because I think that a lot of people in Jacksonville say, oh, they're doing the right thing by like just kind of like filling up the like middle of the depth chart and addressing needs. But then there's definitely a lot of national analysts that kind of look at the Jaguars like, what are they doing? They get about some interesting contracts. And so do you think, like, in general, to make it binary, like, do you think this is a team acting more like a contender or a non-contender in free agency so far?
Yeah, I think it's a little in between. I think those two kind of sentiments that you said of it does make sense that they are filling in some things. And I think that is a smart way to approach free agency. Usually if you're trying to, shop in that mid-tier a little bit, that's when you're going to find the best values, because good players or great players, they just don't hit free agency anymore. Yeah. As someone who has ranked the top 100 free agents over the past 2 years, the project that I've done, the guys who I initially rank like what my top 10 looks like usually isn't super exciting when I put it together. Then by the time free agency starts, especially this year, the top 10 that I've put together, like 8 of them usually aren't even hitting the market, whether it's from the tag. We didn't see a lot of tags this year, but re-signings, we saw a few of them come through before it actually started. So it's tough to really build out and strike big in free agency. So I think there were some places where, filling out a roster and those middle to back parts of the roster does make sense. For the Jags, I think where they went specifically was a little strange. I'm sure, there's been a lot of talk about the Jordan Lewis contract, which again, you can get out of it in 2 years, but, paying someone who's 30 already to be the top nickel corner on the market, that's strange. It's probably wasn't necessary. Like, I don't know who exactly they were bidding against there. And then, there's some other things like Dyami Brown is a player that I really like, was a big fan of him coming out. You saw him kind of get to the role I was kind of hoping he would be at the end of last season. Jaguars signed him for 1 year, $10 million, which is fine. The problem there is your best case scenario is he plays like the player you're hoping he is, and then he's going to hit the market again. So even there, you're not necessarily really looking ahead to what he can be. You're, already paying him for what you're hoping he's going to be at $10 million a year. And then if he hits, he's going to be more expensive in 2026. So you didn't even really build in much of a safety net of, your projection for potential 2026 contract, which again, like you can just kind of quibble with some of the things, but these are the things that you can kind of like really be thinking about. And smarter teams, I think maybe more experienced teams. And the whole thing with the Jaguars too is they were so late into this process, right? They had their GM when we first got the schedule for the combine of who was talking. It was still Jaguars GM TBD was who was scheduled to be at a podium. So it's a very rushed process. So I think there is a bit of a grading curve there that needs to be in place. So, you get some of the offensive line. Again, I think Patrick McCarty is a fun piece who is going to be decent at wherever he needs to play. Getting Robert Hainsey is, not sexy at center, but someone who did spend some time with Liam Coen, which helps. So again, if you're hitting singles in free agency, I think that's fine, because I think we have seen the Jaguars, try to swing for some home runs in past years, and that's where it's really hurt them. And I don't think anything they did this year is going to be, to that level.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Christian Kirk, I think, is a good example, even of like how you were saying at the top, like good players just simply don't hit free agency very often. And so Christian Kirk, I think the Jaguars certainly did have to overpay a little bit to kind of like convince him to come to Jacksonville specifically. But at the same time, Christian Kirk was always going to get a really big contract, because even players of his caliber just like aren't always available. For De'Ami Brown, I totally agree. Where like I think ideally you'd make it like a 2-year contract that like you could get out in 1 year. Like a 2-year deal that's really a 1-year deal with not a lot of guarantees on the second deal. So with that, I wonder if like De'Ami's camp would have like were only interested in 1-year deals so that they could hit the market sooner. But that's definitely a big assumption. And for Jordan Lewis, I assume they were just kind of bidding against the Cowboys, which I don't know if the Cowboys were getting up close to that money point necessarily. But I think that Jordan Lewis is kind of like the belle of the ball, at least in terms of like culture setting too, because that's definitely something that the Jags have been harping on, is they want intangibly rich players to come in and kind of boost their ecosystem just by being themselves. And so after free agency, even though the Jaguars did get 9 guys and 9 guys on the first day, they haven't gotten anyone after that. And notably, they haven't signed anyone on the defensive line. And Jacksonville's defense last year, especially its pass defense, was pretty horrific. And I think that you could chalk that up certainly both to the pass rush and the pass coverage. But there's no doubt that the Jaguars need some depth behind Trayvon Walker and Josh Hines-Allen to rush the passer. But the Jags general manager, James Gladstone, did say last week that they want to be able to like have rookies be able to step into roles immediately and see the field. And so like, what do you think of all of this in terms of Jacksonville's approach to the defensive line, considering it's objectively a position of need for them? But do you think that they're doing it not necessarily like the right way, but in a way that makes sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially when you're looking at what was available this year, it was a tough edge class to be trying to add things. Like Josh Sweat was really like the one kind of young guy, and he's a guy who it took a pay cut last year because wasn't playing up to his potential, and then had a great season on a Super Bowl winning team. So again, you're running with a lot of, volatility there. And it's a lot of, some older guys. It was, Khalil Mack at the top of the market really, but then again, like he resigns. So it definitely a tough place to be trying to get some impact players there. I think you can, still maybe grab some depth, but if you are kind of looking for, some of those young guys, that might be where you can, be hitting in the, middle rounds of the draft is probably potentially a sweet spot to be betting on, some of these kind of athletic guys who are going to be fill-in, maybe be some, potential, rotational pass rushers, which I think is just what they need. They just need depth because they're so often between the Hines-Allen and Walker. They were just doing everything. And it's very hard to live that way when you only have 2 guys. So bringing in, I think some young depth is probably the smart way to go, because otherwise you're probably overpaying for it in free agency.
That makes sense. In terms of turning it to the draft, I think that a lot of people are understandably pigeonholing Mason Graham, the Michigan defensive tackle, to the Jaguars for their 5th overall selection in April. I mean, especially with like the fact that the Patriots seem to be the only team that would feasibly take Mason Graham before the Jaguars. The Patriots had the 4th pick, but now it seems like they're more likely going to take an offensive tackle, or at least not a defensive tackle, because they did sign Milton Williams in free agency to a huge contract. They already have Christian Barmore. I feel like there's a couple of other guys I'm forgetting too, even. And so for the Patriots, like their defensive tackle need is kind of filled, but defensive tackle / defensive line / pass rusher, whatever you want to call it, obviously, as we just talked about, is not filled in Jacksonville. And so do you expect Mason Graham to be a Jaguar in about 6 weeks' time, or do you think it's not like that certain?
Yeah, I would never say anything right now on March 19th is certain for the draft. Because I think we always see, even in the top 5, when we can try to project what's going to happen, there's always, one fit that seems to make a lot of sense, and it usually makes too much sense and it's not going to happen. Because I think we can see a bunch of stuff. Obviously, like, it is probably the most likely fit. You look at, consensus big boards right now. I'm looking at the Athletics, he's 4th. But like you said, the Patriots would be the team who would, potentially do it. But like you said, I was talking to some people on the Patriots beat, and that just doesn't make any sense for them to be going an interior defensive line now after, what they've done. So he probably will be the best player on the board when they pick. I guess depending on what does happen. Yeah, I think if we see 2 quarterbacks go in the top 5, maybe that makes it a little interesting. With if a Travis Hunter falls, that's really fun. So you never know. I also wouldn't be surprised if Jacksonville is a trade back team, just to kind of get some more of those picks and get a higher volume of some of those depth pieces as you get into those middle rounds. Like you said, James Gladstone was talking about. So I wouldn't be surprised if they do, trade back to just kind of recoup and reset a little bit. So I think a lot of things are on the table, and I don't think there's a wrong way they can go, which is good in a sense. Usually that means you have so many holes that whoever you pick is probably going to be playing a role, which it doesn't necessarily, make it great for your roster. But I do think kind of where they're sitting, as long as they're not picking, Ashton Genty 5th, I think like wherever they go is probably going to be an okay thing for whatever the roster looks like.
For sure. Are there any prospects at the top of the list? I mean, like, as you kind of said, or Travis Hunter would probably be the dream. Ashton Genty would probably be the nightmare. But like, if you were Jaguars GM, do you think that you would maybe not sprint to the podium, but like, would Mason Graham be like a pretty automatic pick for you at 5? Or is there anyone else that you think the Jaguars should seriously consider, especially because unlike the vast majority of years, like, this is a pretty solid class for like interior pass rushers. And so even if you don't take Mason Graham, obviously he's the best in the class, but I think they can still address that position later. And so do you think that like people are overthinking Mason Graham, or do you think that there's a couple other prospects they should keep their eye on as well?
Yeah, I would just always kind of keep an open mind for all of these things. I think when any one fan base gets too obsessed with one guy, again, like we said, it usually is not going to happen. Like, unless you're picking number 1, like, and you kind of know what's going to happen. We just don't know. There's so many out there. So I think, kind of like I said, I think there's not a lot of bad options where I think all of these guys who kind of are expected to go up in the top 10, especially on defense, I think good. What kind of interests me as someone who is looking at the offense and wouldn't help for defense, but a trade back and then grabbing either like a Tyler Warren or a Colson Loveland, I think is super interesting for what this offense could be. Obviously, those are 2 very different tight ends, and I think they almost play different positions. But adding that kind of middle of the field type of threat, even, Colson Loveland, who plays a little more, slot and wide receiver. But having that in terms of being able to kind of have all the attention in the middle of the field while Brian Thomas Jr. is doing all the things he does. Now you have a Diami Brown who's a deep threat. I think that really rounds out the offense and has a much, wider range of what you can do with some of those, skill position players. So I could see that. Again, I don't think there's a bad way they can go here. And I think if they just, sit back, take Mason Graham, I think that does help a defensive line that definitely needed some help last year.
Yeah, it would be really interesting to see if it or like when they take a tight end, I guess, because they released Evan Engram, but they brought in two free agents, Johnny Munt and Hunter Long, who are like certainly not going to be like game wreckers. At least I don't expect. But at the same time, as new free agents, I certainly assume they'll make the team. And then the Jags still have former second round pick Brenton Strange, and so it's possible that they'll carry 4 tight ends. But I think that they should probably consider it, considering how good this class is from top to bottom. Not just Loveland and Warren, who are certainly like undoubtedly first round caliber prospects, but it's a really deep class too. So it'll be interesting to see where they end up taking tight end specifically. But I do think there's a little bit of smoke coming out of Jacksonville from various reporters that like the Jags do want to spend maybe their first, second round pick, or at least a day 2 pick on a pass catcher. I assume that would probably be a wide receiver, but it could be a tight end, like maybe a Mason Taylor too. But you just wrote a really good article for the 33rd team about the wide receiver class, trying to break down who really is the wide receiver 1. And so I was wondering if you could talk about what you found and discovered in that article, but then also like what it means for the Jaguars and which receivers you think might be a good fit for them, especially on day 2.
Yeah, so I do this thing kind of every year as I'm looking at the receivers, because it's as someone who kind of starts with numbers usually and then kind of dives into film in a way, it's very hard to figure out what college receivers are doing, because college offenses are so just wildly different. Like some of them are playing different sports. So, you know, a 1,000-yard guy who's averaging, 12 yards per target in one offense is going to be completely different than a 700-yard guy averaging like 7 yards per target. But the guy with the 7 yards per target might have a much higher degree of difficulty based on the quarterback, how open the offense is, things. So I try to take that figure and kind of adjust it for the offense and just kind of look at the yards per target for a wide receiver over what an offense is doing anytime they don't throw to that receiver. So it just kind of gives what they've added to the offense. So I think it's been a fun metric to use over the past, couple years. It's not, an end all be all metric, but it just kind of gives some context to kind of what they were doing in the offense, how good the offense was, how much they added singularly to it. So there are this class is interesting because there aren't a lot of guys that people are excited about to be like that dominant number 1 guy. It's really, Ted McMillan, and that's really it. And I think this is similar to like the 2023 class, where no one was really excited about those receivers, but there were some good receivers in that class. Like Jordan Addison was good, but again, didn't go till like the 20s. Then you go into the second round where you had like a Jaden Reed, Tank Dell, a bunch of those guys. So I think this class kind of goes to that one a little bit. And I think that's where we'll see, some of that value is going to be late first, second round, where you're still getting good players, just might not be a number 1, which makes people on the outside a little lower on this class, but still some good players. So I think, Ted McMillan, it still comes out really well with that. The guy I really like, who I think everyone likes at this point, is Matthew Golden from Texas. Just so explosive. One of those things, like even if he didn't run a 4.29 at the combine, I really do not care about wide receiver 40s because it's such a position of like, do you know what you're doing? Can you get open? There's so many different ways to get open. If you're doing that at 4.6, that's better than a guy who runs a 4.2 who doesn't know how to get open. And I think we have seen a couple of those come into the league over the past couple of years. So it certainly is interesting, but Golden had the second most plays of 20 or more yards among college receivers this past year. I think he was the best Texas receiver in that. So I think like if you kind of go down the list and you're looking for like some deep threats, like an Arian Smith from Georgia is a guy who I think is really interesting. A track star, like an actual like star who was, a really great track guy who was still learning the receiver position as he was going through Georgia, battled some injuries, had a pretty good year this year, and I think can still be refined a little bit in what he's doing. But the fact that he's still working his way into receiver and added so much to that Georgia offense when he was targeted, I think certainly helps. So if you can just kind of look at a bunch of these guys going down, there are some decent players that I think if Jacksonville wants to go in day 2 or so, there are going to be some fun fits there that I think you're going to get some useful role players. Even again, if people are mostly down on this receiver class, just because there's not that, number one.
Yeah, I mean, that works for the Jaguars since they do have a number one already in Brian Thomas. And he's a really good example of what you were talking about earlier about, like, it's really hard to evaluate receivers because even Brian Thomas was super productive. He led college football in receiving touchdowns his final season in 2023, but he was really running a very limited route tree. So it's pretty tough to be able to project that to the next level to say, oh, this guy can really win in a variety of ways. It's just hard to say that when you don't actually see it on the film and also in terms of the production. But to start kind of wrapping up a little bit, I did want to get kind of a general vibe check, temperature check from you on Liam Coen, or if you're like all in on the hire, if you're cautiously optimistic, if you hate it and you think that Doug Peterson should have been retained. Just what do you think in general about Liam Coen being the new head coach?
Yeah, so I don't think, especially for the Jaguars, I don't think I'm ever going to go above cautiously optimistic, just because I just think that's
no
safe.
One in Jacksonville will either, I don't think.
Right. I think that is probably the top tier. That is just safe to put yourself out. But in terms of what he does and what this offense can potentially be, I really like the fit. Like, I think it is going to do. I think what he did last year with Tampa Bay, the one and for what just kind of the way he made Baker's job easier. I think that was what was missing so much in Jacksonville, where I think they saw Trevor Lawrence and went, "Oh, you're very good at all of this stuff. We're going to put all of this on your plate." And there was no margin for error in so much of what Trevor Lawrence did over the past couple of years. If he was not perfect, this offense was not functioning. And, that is an expectation you can put on a quarterback, but it's very hard for any quarterback to have that kind of down in, down out like he did. So I think what Liam Coen is going to do is make things a lot easier on him. I think they're going to be able to combine some of the quick game that the Jaguars found success in and probably relied on a little too much. But it's quick game with being able to push the ball down the field. I think Baker was super high in throws under 2.5 seconds that still went to the intermediate level of the field. And that's something that really only like the Dolphins do, with Tua and their speed. So it's a much different way in the way the Dolphins do it, but those were really the only two offenses that were pushing the ball down the field to that extent, that quickly, which I think is going to also help, kind of protect the offensive line from itself too, if that doesn't completely mesh to begin the season. So I think there's just a lot of ways that they're going to be able to open up some things that Trevor does well. I think that is eventually going to then open up some things down the field where I think Trevor is still a very good thrower. The screen game last year for Tampa Bay was just incredible. And that's such an easy button for a quarterback, again, who does not have to do anything on that play. And it's going to potentially be a positive play when you look at how effective they were on screens last year and how ineffective Jacksonville was. That's just completely changes in offense when those plays can be positive plays. And then I think when just in terms of that intermediate area, just in general, I think Liam Coen was so good at whether it was the quick game or just within the offense, opening that up. And I think Trevor Lawrence is a very good intermediate thrower, just did not have a lot of chances to be doing that. It was, a lot of hitches and comebacks, which are just static routes that don't have a lot of, chances to do anything after they're caught. So even if he's super accurate, that's where the play ends, where it's caught. Meanwhile, Tampa Bay was running a whole bunch of digs and things like that. So I think you're getting Brian Thomas on some of those. There's going to be a lot of room to run. I just think overall it's going to be a much better structured offense. I think Trevor Lawrence is going to have some easier plays that he's going to be able to make them in terms of just not having to do so much to make this offense function. And I think taking the load off of him is then going to make him better. And I think that's kind of going to be what the Liam Coen offense really is, which I think is something to be optimistic about if you are a Jags fan looking at what the ceiling could potentially be for this offense.
Absolutely. Yeah, you made a ton of great points there. I definitely agree that the offense was static. I think it was static in general. Like even they had like some like just like good NFL play calls, but like it was just like throwing it against the wall against like whatever defense. And like the Jags, I think certainly were near the bottom of the league in terms of yards after the catch generated. And a large part of that is because of play designs, not being able to get a lot of players moving after the catch. Really the middle of the field was like not really used a lot in Jacksonville. I don't know if that's just because like Evan Engram and Christian Kirk like couldn't like fill that role as well as they needed to, or if it's like more of a Trevor thing where he like going back to even college and high school, he's like always been really good at kind of throwing balls up to the sideline and kind of like reading out plays on one side of the field and kind of making decisions based on what the corner and safety are doing on one side. So maybe it's a Trevor thing, maybe it's a personnel thing, maybe it's a coaching thing. Definitely think the middle, like the intermediate level, but over the middle of the field specifically needs to be opened up in Liam Coen's offense. But the thing that stood out to me most that you talked about was Baker Mayfield being so good about getting the ball out quickly, but also getting the ball out far down the field. And I remember during Trevor's best season, 2023, he was second in that stat in terms of like highest depth of target in under 2.5 seconds. And he was second only behind Tua Tagovailoa with the Dolphins, who's like, that's not a Tua stat, that's a Dolphin stat because like the speed of Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle allow them to operate the offense that way. Meanwhile, in Jacksonville, like Trevor was throwing to Marvin Jones and Zay Jones and guys like that who did not have quite the same game-breaking speed. So definitely excited to see where Liam Coen is able to take not just the offense in general, but specifically Trevor Lawrence. And so to officially wrap up, what lingering questions do you have about the Jaguars? Maybe entering the draft, but I guess more so for the 2025 season, excuse me. What questions do you still have that you're looking forward to maybe getting the answers to in the coming calendar year?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I obviously want to see what this offense looks like, but I think I have an idea of what that is. I think what the defense looks like is definitely going to be a question that I think does set the tone of what the Jaguars can be. Because I do think the offense is going to be productive in one way or another. But I was someone who did come into last year with some higher expectations based on what their personnel was, with how I thought it was going to mesh with what Ryan Nielsen wanted to do. And that was just a disaster and it did not work at all. So it's a lot of kind of running a couple of the same players back. I'm interested to see if, the players who are good can kind of reach a potential in this new defense and how they're trying to, fit some of those players around, right? Like after you're sliding in Jordan Lewis in the slot. So you're moving some other pieces around there. So what this defense looks like and how they kind of think about fitting the players that they have into what this new defense is going to be. I think that'll be the most, and maybe not the most interesting thing because the offense obviously is going to take, so much of the focus, but I do think that will be that. I think that will set the floor and probably the ceiling too of how competitive this team is going to be and how quickly that defense clicks.
Absolutely. No, I mean, you're right. Like, obviously, most of the eyeballs and attention will be on Liam Coen and Trevor Lawrence and Brian Thomas, the rest of the offense. But obviously, defense matters. Defense wins championships. And so I'm interested not just in, like, what the scheme is, how the players are kind of, like, fit into the scheme, as you're saying, but also whether the scheme, like, stays consistent and whether, like, the defensive coordinator keeps his promise. Because I think that you and I and a lot of other people, both in and out of Jacksonville, were excited for what Ryan Nielsen could do with that unit last year. But Nielsen had a very press man, or not even necessarily. There was less man than people probably think, but a ton of press coverage,
Press, yeah.
Very aggressive defense. and he like preached that during the offseason, but then just like didn't hold up his end of the bargain. He just turned to a much more conservative approach that just like was against the philosophy that he was preaching. And so I'm interested in seeing what defense coordinator Anthony Campanile runs, especially because he has experience under like two pretty different defenses. There's Todd Halfley last year in Green Bay, but Campanile also has a decent amount of experience in the Vic Fangio tree. And so what the philosophy ends up being, but then also whether they actually stick to it, I think is another question. So before you get out of here, very random question, but March Madness brackets are due tomorrow. Do you have any takes? I think you're a Temple man, right? I don't even know if they're in the tournament, but
I don't believe they are. No, I have watched, I think, 0 seconds of college basketball so far this season. So that might make me qualified to have a good March Madness bracket.
True.
Who knows? But yeah, I have absolutely zero. I have zero insight. Usually I end up taking North Carolina just a lot, which I think is going to be controversial this year. They won last night, right?
Yes.
So yeah, that's where I am in college basketball right now. I'll throw some games on. I might fill out a bracket. I don't even know. So I'm not the guy that you're going to be hoping to get any useful information there.
All right, no worries. Well, we definitely got a lot of useful information from you today about the Jaguars. You can get tons of useful information from Dan about the NFL at large. You want to go ahead and plug your work before we get out here?
Yeah, you can now find me on Twitter, Blue Sky, Dan Pizzuta, at the 33rd team for like another 2 weeks. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Doing some fun stuff. So just keep an eye on the socials, and I'll be plugging away at stuff. So yeah, that fun time during the off season. Draft coming up soon, and then straight to work on the FDN Almanac after that. So
awesome.
fun times coming. Yeah.
Sweet. All right. Well, Dan, thanks so much for joining. Make sure to check out Dan's work on social media and the 33rd team, everywhere else he ends up being. Thanks again. Thanks to everyone for watching and listening. I will be back here tomorrow at 9:04 a.m. Eastern with Mia O'Brien. So see you guys then. Thanks as always.